The humidity at Fort Liberty clung heavy over the long-distance range, carrying the sharp smell of burnt cordite, the oily tang of pressurized hydraulic fluid, and the faint metallic taste of spent brass lingering in the air. On Lane 9, a group of Tier 1 candidates, young men with tactical beards and high-end optics, paused their drills to smirk. In the center of their high-speed world stood Emily Kyle, a 64-year-old woman in a faded Camp Perry sweatshirt, adjusting a pair of thick, wire-rimmed glasses that seemed better suited for a library than a firing line. She appeared fragile against the concussive thud of their Scar H rifles, her vintage bolt-action M24 looking like a museum relic. The younger soldiers didn't see a warrior. They saw a grandmother who had wandered off from a quilting bee, and their whispers of pensioner and relic cut through the gritty feel of North Carolina sand underfoot. They had no idea that the rifle she held had more confirmed kills than their entire platoon combined, or that her name was scrubbed from every public record in the Pentagon, her touch on the stock as steady as the earth itself. Fictional stories, real courage. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment from Hidden Sniper Stories. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? Emily Kyle didn't mind the whispers. In fact, she counted on them. At 64, her hair was a soft salt and pepper, pulled back into a practical bun that didn't interfere with her cheek weld. She moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, a habit born not from age, but from a lifetime of navigating high alpine terrain where a single displaced pebble could spell disaster. To the young rangers on the range, she was an underdog, a civilian hobbyist who had somehow talked her way onto a restricted line. The leader of the group, a corporal named Ryan Murphy with a Punisher patch and an ego to match, watched her settle her sandbags. He nudged his buddy, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. To them, Emily was a ghost of a bygone era, someone who belonged in the history books they skimmed. They saw the sensible cargo pants and the slight tremor in her left hand, a remnant of a cold night in the Hindu Kush, and they saw weakness. Emily's internal world, however, was a sharp contrast to her unassuming exterior. As she wiped a speck of dust from her loopholed glass, her mind wasn't on the mockery. She was calculating the 12-mile-per-hour crosswind coming off the tree line, noting the way the heat haze shimmered over the 800-yard berm. She could feel the atmospheric pressure shifting in the marrow of her bones, a sensory gift honed during decades of classified service where today's technology was once a distant dream. The smell of pine resin mixed with gun oil filled her nostrils, grounding her. She remembered the feel of the mud in the Balkans in the 90s, the cold seeping into her joints while she waited 36 hours for a single target to step into a window. That mission had tested her like Carlos Hathcock's tales from Vietnam, where patience was the true weapon. She recalled the silence of the desert at 3 a.m, where the only sound was the rhythmic hum of her own heart. These men around her were loud. They relied on suppressors and ballistic computers. Emily relied on the air itself. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of chamois leather, rubbing the bolt of her M24. It was a rhythmic, soothing motion, the cool metal smooth under her fingers. A faint flicker of fatigue tugged at her edges, a reminder that her body wasn't as resilient as it once was, though her mind remained sharp. Ryan walked over, his chest puffed out, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Ma'am, you know the targets out there are at 800, right?" This isn't the local turkey shoot. One of the candidates, a quiet specialist named Alex, frowned slightly, his eyes darting between Emily and the group. He sensed something off in her steady gaze. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable at the 300-yard civilian side," Ryan continued. Emily didn't look up immediately. She finished her stroke on the metal, the steel clicking softly, a sound that echoed in her ears like an old friend. "I like the view from here, Corporal," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, carrying a rasp of authority that made Ryan blink. "The wind is more honest at this distance." Ryan laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that drew the attention of the other candidates. Alex shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on his own rifle stock, feeling the rough texture under his palm. Emily simply nodded, her eyes narrowing behind her thick lenses. She wasn't offended. In her world, the loud ones were the first to go. She went back to her underdog routine, fumbling slightly with her match-grade ammunition boxes, letting them think she was just a lucky amateur. But beneath the sweatshirt, her pulse was a steady 60 beats per minute. She was exactly where she wanted to be. The touch of the warm sun on her skin contrasted with the cool shade from the baffles, and the distant call of a hawk pierced the air. Emily drew in a breath, savoring the mix of earth and machinery, her senses alive as ever. For a moment, she wondered if her age made her irrelevant in this fast world, but the rifle in her hands pushed the thought aside. The tension on the range began to bake under the midday sun. Ryan and his squad were running cold bore drills, 1 shot, 1 kill, no warm-ups. It was the bread and butter of sniper school, and the boys were struggling. The shifting winds of Fort Liberty were notorious, swirling between the pines and creating pockets of dead air that sent match-grade bullets veering inches wide of the steel gongs. "Damn it," Ryan hissed, staring through his high-end spotting scope after his third shot clipped the edge of the berm instead of the steel. "The glass says hold left, but the air is pulling right. This range is haunted." He looked over at Emily, who was still meticulously setting up her spot. She hadn't fired a single round yet. She was just sitting there, watching the grass sway, the sight of it bending in the breeze like a living map. To Ryan, it looked like senility. To an expert, it was reading the book. A flash of insecurity crossed Ryan's mind. He was weeks from deployment, and missing these shots gnawed at his confidence, the pressure from selection weighing heavy. "Hey, Grandma," Ryan called out, his frustration boiling over. "Since you're an expert on honest wind, why don't you show us how it's done? Or are you just here to soak up the AC in the canteen later?" The other soldiers chuckled, a low, collective rumble of judgment. They were a pack, and she was the outsider. But Alex, the quiet one, didn't join in. He crossed his arms, his brow furrowed, feeling the sticky sweat on his skin as he watched her calm demeanor. The group dynamics were clear. She was the designated target for their pre-deployment nerves. Emily finally looked at him. She didn't look angry. She looked bored. 800 yards is a long way for a man who trusts his computer more than his eyes, Corporal. Ryan stiffened, his own doubts flickering beneath the bravado. The mockery turned into a challenge. "Tell you what. 1 shot. If you hit the center of that steel gong at 800, I'll clean your rifle for a week. If you miss, which you will, you pack up that antique and tell the rangemaster you're done for the day. Deal?" The rangemaster, a sergeant first class named Harlan York, stepped forward to intervene, but Emily held up a hand. Her gesture was small, but it had a weight to it that made the sergeant pause. He saw something in her eyes, a flicker of predatory stillness he hadn't seen since his days in the sandbox, the smell of distant smoke lingering in memory. "What would you have done in that moment?" Emily asked quietly, though she wasn't speaking to Ryan. She was speaking to the memory of her spotter, a man named Elias who had died in a valley she couldn't name. "I accept," Emily said. She didn't lay down immediately. She stood there, watching a hawk circle above the tree line, its cry sharp against the hum of insects. She was waiting for the lull, the 3-second window where the thermal currents equalized. The soldiers gathered around, some filming on their phones, expecting a hilarious fail. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of pine and the arrogant energy of youth, the hot sun beating down on exposed necks. Alex whispered to another. "She doesn't seem nervous," his voice low. Emily knelt, her movements suddenly losing their grandmotherly clunkiness. She slid behind the M24, and the rifle seemed to merge with her body. She didn't use a rangefinder. She didn't check a tablet. She licked her index finger, held it up to the hot Carolina air, feeling the breeze cool the moisture, and then dialed 3 clicks into her elevation knob. Click, click, click. The sound was like a heartbeat in the sudden hush of the range, echoing in their ears. Ryan leaned in, whispering to his buddy. "She's not even looking at the flags." The touch of his phone in his pocket felt heavy, recording what he thought would be a joke. Emily took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cycle. She wasn't seeing the steel gong. She was seeing the air. She was seeing the invisible river of oxygen between her and the target. The wind tugged at her sweatshirt, the fabric rough against her skin. Harlan York watched closely, his own pulse quickening. This wasn't adding up. The group hushed, the only sounds the distant thud of other ranges and the rustle of leaves. Emily felt the trigger's wall, that tiny fraction of a pound before the sear breaks. Her senses sharpened, the sight of the target shimmering, the smell of heated metal, the touch of the stock against her cheek. A brief reflection crossed her mind. At her age, did she still belong here, proving herself to these young ones? As Emily settled into her prone position, the sergeant first class noticed something he hadn't seen before. Her sweatshirt had crawled up her arm slightly. On her inner wrist was a small, faded tattoo of a sparrow carrying an olive branch, but the branch was made of barbed wire. It was a unit insignia so rare that most modern soldiers didn't even know it existed. It was the mark of the Gray Sparrows, a long-disbanded deniable asset team from the Cold War's final shadows. He felt a chill despite the heat, the touch of wind on his neck raising goosebumps. He also noticed her grip. Most modern shooters used a thumb over or a vertical grip. Emily's thumb was tucked along the side of the stock, a very specific technique used by long-range shooters in the late 80s to prevent pulse jump during the shot. It was old school, in the way a samurai sword was old school obsolete, only to those who didn't understand its lethality. The smell of her chamois leather mixed with gun oil wafted faintly. Emily's eyes weren't squinting. They were wide, relaxed. She was using both eyes, open targeting, a skill that takes years to master under combat stress. The way she adjusted her bipod wasn't with a fumbling hand, but with the sharp, downward pressure of her shoulder, loading the bipod against the concrete, the gritty texture biting into her elbow. The wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the range's baffles, a high-pitched sound that set teeth on edge. The young soldiers stepped back, sensing the shift in the air. The amateur was gone. In her place was something cold, something made of steel and patience. Alex leaned forward, whispering, "Look at her hands. They're steady as rock." Ryan shot him a glare, but doubt flickered in his eyes. The scar on her collarbone peaked briefly as she shifted, a jagged line from a high-velocity ricochet, pink against her skin. Harlan York's breath caught, the smell of sweat thickening around the group. This woman had seen fire. Her preparation was theater-proven, not textbook. The touch of the trigger under her finger was familiar, like an old scar. No one spoke, the quiet heavy with unspoken questions. The M24 barked, not the muffled thwip of a suppressed modern rifle, but the raw, unadulterated thunder of a .308 Winchester. Before the sound had even finished echoing off the backstop, the tang of metal on metal rang out. The gong at 800 yards didn't just vibrate, it swung violently. Through his spotting scope, Ryan's jaw dropped. The bullet hadn't just hit the gong, it had struck the bolt head, a 2-inch circle in the very center used to hang the plate. "Fluke," Ryan muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. The acrid smell of cordite filled the air, stinging nostrils. Emily didn't say a word. She didn't even look up from the scope. She worked the bolt with a lightning-fast flick of her wrist. "Who? Chak-shak." The spent brass flew over her shoulder, glinting in the sun like a falling gold coin, the hot metal warm to the touch if caught. Tang. Another hit. Exactly on top of the first one. She did it 3 more times. 5 shots. 5 hits. A sub-2-inch group at nearly half a mile with a rifle that was 30 years old and an optic that didn't have a digital readout. The hush that followed was heavy. The young soldiers looked at each other, the mockery replaced by a growing, uncomfortable realization. This wasn't a hobbyist. This was a master. The recoil's kick vibrated through her body, a familiar jolt. Emily stood up, her face unchanged. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like she'd just finished a grocery list. "The wind is holding at a 2-minute angle to the left, Corporal," she said, looking Ryan in the eye, "and your bipod is loose. That's why you're throwing your shots. It's not the range that's haunted. It's your fundamentals." She began to pack her gear, her hands moving with that same mechanical grace. She remembered a night in 2003, high in the Hindu Kush, where she had to hold a ridge alone for 14 hours, her shots precise like Chris Kyle's in the Iraqi sands. The rhythm of the bolt was the only thing that kept the fear at bay. She had lived 1,000 lives in those moments, and these boys were just beginning their first. A subtle vulnerability surfaced then, a quiet ache in her shoulder from the old wound, reminding her of the toll. "Wait," Ryan said, his voice quiet now. "Who are you? Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Emily paused, her hand on the handle of her rifle case, feeling the worn leather. "I was just a clerk, Corporal. That's what the files say, anyway." Alex nodded slowly, respect dawning in his eyes, the sound of his own breathing loud in the hush. The group shifted, the touch of the sun now feeling less oppressive. Harlan York checked his watch, but his mind was elsewhere. The mini twist hung in the air, the smell of success mingling with surprise. The sound of a heavy diesel engine approaching broke the quiet. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to the range office. A man stepped out, wearing a retired colonel's insignia on his civilian jacket. It was Colonel James Mattis, a former JSOC liaison known in quiet circles. The rangemaster snapped to attention, and the candidates followed suit, their spines straightening like iron rods. Mattis ignored the formalities, his eyes scanning the line until they landed on lane 9. He walked past the elite Tier 1 candidates without a glance. He stopped 3 feet from Emily. His hand trembled slightly as he removed his cap, standing at a rigid position of attention. He didn't speak at first, just studied her stance, then the rifle. A nod of recognition crossed his face, gradual, as if piecing together old reports. "The Weaver," the colonel finally said, his voice thick with a respect that bordered on reverence, his breath shallow. The soldiers exchanged glances. The Weaver was a legend, whispered in the halls of Fort Bragg, a ghost sniper from the black programs who had shaped key operations. Her files were classified because of the sensitive chain of command they bypassed. "Hello, James," Emily said, a small smile finally touching her lips. "I see you're still touring the old grounds. I told you that mission in Mogadishu would stick with you." The colonel didn't smile back. He looked like he was standing in the presence of a monument, his posture rigid, eyes wide. The quiet on the range deepened. The young soldiers, including Ryan, looked like they wanted to vanish into the sand. They hadn't just mocked an old woman. They had mocked the foundation of their own profession. Mattis's gaze held steady, a subtle nod conveying volumes, the recognition unfolding like a shared secret. Colonel Mattis looked at Ryan, then at the steel gong still swinging at 800 yards. He didn't need to be told what had happened. He knew Emily. "Corporal," the colonel said, his voice like grinding stones. "Yes, sir." Ryan barked, his face pale, his earlier insecurity now fully exposed. "I believe you owe this lady a rifle cleaning. And if I find a single speck of carbon on that M24, I'll have you painting every rock on this base with a toothbrush." "Yes, sir." Emily walked over to Ryan. She didn't scold him. She didn't humiliate him further. She simply handed him the cleaning kit from her bag. "Watch the crown of the barrel, son. It's sensitive. Just like a soldier's ego." She looked at the group of young men who were about to head into the dark places of the world. Her expression softened. "You're fast," she said quietly. "But fast is for people who expect to miss. Be still. The world will move around you, if you let it." The candidates didn't cheer. They didn't clap. One by one, they removed their caps. It was a silent, earned tribute, the kind that isn't found in manuals or movies. It was the recognition of a legacy that had been carried in the shadows so they could walk in the light. Alex was the first, his hands steady now. Ryan followed, his ego deflated, but respect blooming. the emotional peak settled like dust after a storm. Emily Kyle climbed into her beat-up Ford F-150. She declined the colonel's offer for a formal dinner at the mess, preferring the quiet of her porch and the company of her memories. As she drove away, she looked in the rearview mirror at the disappearing silhouette of the range. She knew she would never be in the history books. Her face would never be on a recruitment poster. But she also knew that somewhere, in a folder deep within the Pentagon, her work had helped maintain fragile balances. In the Army, it's not the gear that wins wars. It's the soldier who reads the battlefield like a book, mastering fundamentals over flashy tech, and embracing humility as the true mark of expertise. Courage isn't about the noise you make or the gear you carry. It's about the quiet discipline of doing what is necessary when no one is watching. Sometimes, the quietest soldiers carry the loudest legacies. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more hidden sniper stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come. Your support helps us honor the veterans whose stories were almost lost to time. Leave a comment below with the branch of service you most respect. Let's keep the conversation going.